to our final panel to wrap it up, and it's my presentation, my pleasure and distinct honor to introduce Barbara Slavin. Barbara is a career journalist and the director of the Future of Iran initiative at the Atlantic Council South Asia Center. She has traveled to Iran for 9 different times. She served as an editor of the New York Times Week in Review, a correspondent for The Economist magazine in Cairo, Egypt, a senior diplomatic reporter for the USA Today, and the assistant managing editor at the Washington Times. And she has authored, the latest book was Bitter Friends, Bosom Enemies, Iran, the US, and the Twisted Path to Confrontation, which is a perfect setup for this last panel. And Barbara, the floor is yours, ma'am.
Okay. Thank you very much. It's a fantastic event, I have to say. I haven't been able to watch all of it, but I did listen in this morning to some of the panels, and I think they're just first rate. So I guess we're it, and hopefully we still have a lot of people with us. We have 2 wonderful speakers. I hope they're with me. I think I saw Vali. I hope Suzanne is as well. Let us see. If I can see Suzanne, are you there too?
I'm here.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, I'm going to give you guys a very brief introduction. I don't know that you need one with this crowd, but Suzanne Maloney is Vice President and Director of the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution. She also served as Deputy Director of Foreign Policy for a number of years. She has become one of the leading experts, certainly on Iran and on US policy toward Iran, and she's advised both Democratic and Republican administrations on Iran policy. I think I first met her back in the 1990s, and so she certainly has paid her dues. And then we have Vali Nasr, who is now the Majid Haduri Professor of International Affairs and Middle East Studies at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, and a new non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council South Asia Center, which is great. So he is now a colleague of mine. He was Dean of Johns Hopkins SAIS, and he also served as senior advisor to the US Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, the late Ambassador Richard Holbrooke. And of course, Vali has written many wonderful books. My personal favorite is The Shia Revival, How Conflicts with Islam Will Shape the Future, which was certainly prescient in terms of its understanding of the ethnic and religious conflicts that continue to roil the Middle East. So I'm going to turn first to Suzanne for her view of Biden's approach to Iran. Do you think that this current effort to rejoin the JCPOA and then make an agreement which is longer and stronger, will this work? Will the Israelis blow it up? Will our other regional friends perhaps intervene in ways that are unexpected? Do you think we're going to be able to get back in and build on it? I guess that's the question.
Thanks, Barbara, and thanks to all of you for the opportunity to be here with you today. I realized, at least in the instructions that I had for the conversation this afternoon, that I am presenting the Hawkish view, which I found slightly amusing, because I don't think, at least in the universe in which I inhabit, I am typically understood to represent the Hawkish view. But I take that responsibility seriously, and it probably does accurately reflect, at least among the friends of the administration, where I stand in terms of how we are seeing the early evolution of the Biden administration's approach to this perennial issue. And you all have spent a day now talking about the many facets of the Iran issue, but the place where I always feel it's important to begin is just the recognition that this has been with us for 42 years. There has been a relative degree of consistency in terms of the tools and options available to each administration, Republican and Democrat, over the course of those 4 decades. And there have been relatively few instances of significant breakthroughs or success. And we can identify, I think, over the course of the conversation, what helped to create those conditions. But I guess I start with the sort of recognition that every American president since 1979 has stepped into office with a fairly considerable problem on Iran. It was bigger, obviously, for the Carter administration than it was perhaps for some of its successors, but every administration has come in hoping to make progress on addressing the various challenges that Iran poses to American interests and to the international system. Every administration, I think, has left office with some sense of disappointment in its ability to accomplish those goals. And again, we can talk about, and you all have been spending the day talking about why that is. So in many respects, the Biden administration predicament is a familiar one. And it's also a familiar set of conditions because, in a sense, despite the fact that this has been an unusually, extraordinarily disruptive and tumultuous year in the history of the world, in many ways, where we were this January, February, March wasn't all that different from where we were last January, February, March, which is to say that we found ourselves in a standoff with the Iranians, with some degree of tensions mounting, but also with some desire, despite rhetoric, desire, I think, on both sides for a diplomatic pathway. That has been a consistent feature of the American approach to Iran, is that every administration has sought to engage directly with the Islamic Republic of Iran. Even if at times they have also sought not to do that. And so, this is just an endemic feature of what we do. We always seek to negotiate with Iran, and we always seek to apply pressure to persuade Iran to stop doing some of the very many bad things that it does do. So, the Biden administration is constructing its own sort of combination of pressure and persuasion, or carrots and sticks, as it was described by the Bush administration. And I think what I found most encouraging at the outset was that we heard from Secretary Blinken, from DNI Avril Haines, from a number of other senior officials that the goal was a longer and stronger deal. And that, should underscore that there's now a consensus that the JCPOA, despite the fact that it was so hard fought that it became a with us or against us issue over the course of the past decade, that there is a recognition that it is, even among its advocates, it's insufficient to address the full scope of the challenges represented by Iran, and even the full scope of the nuclear issue, in part because, of course, it had a timeline. And so whatever the value you attach to the JCPOA in 2015, and I was an advocate, I attached a high value to it, that value is inevitably less today. Less both because of the proximity to some of the expiration dates of the sunset clauses, but also less because of the Trump administration, because of the events of the past 4 years, the Iranians have themselves walked back their own obligations under the deal. And to some extent, some of their new nuclear activities, so even if they're reversed, they have gained knowledge, experience, capacity that can't be reversed. And so we are in a different position. Much as we might like to simply erase the past 4 years, we can't do that. We can't simply revert to status quo ante. And so from where I sit, the right approach is to keep our eye on the prize of what our goal is here. And our goal with respect to nuclear negotiations with Iran is to ensure that Iran does not move closer to nuclear weapons capability. It is not to restore the deal. It is not to revive our reputation in the world. It is primarily to keep Iran as far away from a bomb as humanly possible. And in my view, the idea that we're going to get back to the JCPOA and then persuade Tehran to go into another deal is fanciful, because the JCPOA provides precisely what the Iranian leadership wants, which is access to the international financial system, but not so much access to Iran that it poses a threat in terms of quote unquote cultural invasion. And so whatever additional incentives we might be able to offer, for example, the relief from the primary US embargo, removal of other additional sanctions, greater people-to-people contact, not of tremendous interest to this leadership in Tehran, because what they're not interested in is the betterment of the situation of the Iranian people. What they're interested in is regime preservation. And the JCPOA was viable precisely because that's what it did. And again, I was a supporter. I acknowledge that was one of the features of it, and it made sense in 2015. But I think as we approach 2022, to tie ourselves to a deal that does not give us any kind of a springboard into a better deal, that does not provide us any additional leverage in terms of managing the other threats that we have with respect to Iran. And particularly if we go back into this deal without addressing the dire situation of Americans who are held on unjust charges purely as bait, as leverage on the part of the Iranian leadership, would be malpractice. I don't think that that's what this administration will do. I think it was notable that Secretary Blinken's first act on Iran was, in fact, to call some of the families of those who are imprisoned in Iran. But I think that, you know, one of the most important takeaways from the experience of the Obama administration should and must be that Iran is not a nuclear issue. The nuclear aspect of the Iranian challenge is the most urgent one. But if we treat Iran as a nuclear problem to be solved and everything else will follow along and somehow, we will see progress across the board, we will be sorely mistaken. And so we have to actually have a holistic strategy that is very well integrated, that we have embraced and really brought along our allies and partners to be part of and to contribute to. That it's bound to failure, because what will happen in 2 years if we begin to approach the obsolescence of some of the aspects of the JCPOA is that there will not be buy-in. There will be pressure to take additional actions against Iran, and we will find ourselves back in a kind of Trump administration scenario. And so, you know, I don't see durability in an easy return to the JCPOA. I see entirely why it's attractive for an administration that has much bigger fish to fry right now than Iran, but I don't think it provides a durable solution to the problem that we're confronted with at this point in time. And I know I'm just about approaching my time limit, so I want to cede the mic and thank you all and look forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Suzanne. I want to turn now to Vali, and let me just add, though, that the Iranians have said that all they will accept at this point is a return to the original JCPOA. They've made it clear that that's the price of admission for other conversations about making a longer and stronger deal. So I'm not quite sure how you manage that. I will, of course, agree on the dual nationals, and hopefully we will finally see some change there, although it may have to await the Iranian elections and a so-called hardliner president. But let me turn to Vali. How do you see it now? And if you could also add the aspect of the region, particularly Afghanistan, because what leverage do we have now? The United States has announced, President Biden has announced that all American troops are going to be out of Afghanistan by September 11th. And Iran has a capacity to make our life easier or harder in that regard. So how should we be approaching this diplomacy with Iran? And is there any other way except a swift return to the original deal as the baseline?
Well, thank you very much, Barbara, for moderating this and for your kind introduction. And it's great to be with Suzanne and you on this important panel. I think Suzanne raised a number of very interesting issues and points of debate, which I think is within the administration as well as among those who discuss Iran. Namely, she's right, we've had a 42-year standoff with Iran. Relations have gone up and down, and now during the Trump administration, they reached a particularly low point. And Iran is likely to be a challenge for the US, both conceptually and in terms of its diplomacy. But at this point in time, I think the administration has to approach this with certain if you would, reality about what is it that they want to achieve at this point in time. And then short of a maximal goal that we will either arrive at a complete satisfactory situation, or that we're going to solve the Iran issue, or even be able to solve all the different things that are at play, from regional to missiles to American, Iranian, as well as other European dual nationals that are in prison, and the nuclear issue. So, writ large, I mean, this administration came in with a view that its priority is China, its priority is domestic stability, is rebuilding the country, that the president actually wants to spend most of his political capital in Congress with the American people on these bigger sets of issues. And it actually wants to push the Middle East down the list of its priorities from where it's been to number 2, 3, 4. And I have to say, this is a sort of a long running goal. That is a threat that has ran through Obama administration's pivot to Asia, to President Trump, to President Biden. It's sort of a reality of where we are domestically and internationally. So unfortunately, the goal of getting out of the Middle East runs through Iran. I think that's also what President Obama understood, not that JCPOA would fix Iran, but that Iran's nuclear program was the most likely reason for another forever war in the Middle East, for another major commitment. And you're not going to get out of the Middle East without putting Iran's nuclear program under some kind of a constraint, as Suzanne mentioned. Now, we can debate what is a satisfactory level of constraint. And I think that's, again, something that's facing the Biden administration. So if it wants to take its aircraft carriers and from the Persian Gulf and park them outside of Taiwan, and it wants to focus its diplomatic and other energies on East Asia, then it has to run through Iran. And then there are two issues for the administration. One is a group of regional conflicts. One or two of them don't involve Iran, like Libya, but Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Yemen in particular, and Afghanistan all involve Iran. And the United States perhaps wants to get out of these, or make sure that they are not combustible issues that will bring us back. And the second one, Iran's nuclear program, and particularly the steps that Iran has taken since 2019 have reduced its breakout time. In other words, the very things that made Israelis and Americans extremely nervous in 2011, 2012, Iran is 6 months away, is 3 months away. We're back to all of that. And in fact, particularly over the past 2 years, the volume of Iran's low enriched uranium, 20% enriched uranium, soon to be 60% enriched uranium, has expanded significantly. And so I think the primary goal looking at this is, in the very short run, and I think this administration has to look at a 2 to 4 year time period, is to find a way to contain this from continuing to spread. And that means how does it step out of the maximum pressure strategy, and how does it sort of restore some kind of a stability to the region? I think its position has shifted from the campaign to this point in time, and that's important to note. During the campaign, the administration then in waiting made a lot of signals that it's interested in compliance for compliance. Its language was restoration of the deal, be it realistic or not, as Suzanne mentioned, but that's what they were saying. In fact, if you read President-elect Biden's op-ed in CNN, he uses that language, that if Iran goes back to its compliance, we're willing to rejoin JCPOA and go back to our compliance, synchronization, timing, et cetera, to be worked out, and that JCPOA will not be comprehensive, would be a floor for additional negotiations to follow. Once the administration came in, it shifted its position. First of all, it didn't take any steps, including humanitarian gestures, signals, et cetera, on COVID, et cetera. Secondly, it backed away from that rhetoric. It now started talking about in Senate confirmation hearings that missiles were on the table, regional issues were on the table, a host of other issues were on the table, and that the United States was looking for a longer, stronger deal. Now, longer, stronger deal in its narrowest sense means JCPOA plus. In a broader sense means everything is on the table, regional issues, missiles, et cetera. And I think that was a significant shift. namely that, and the rhetoric of the administration began to say they're not interested in JCPOA, they're interested in putting Iran's nuclear program under very strict guidelines. Now, we can debate why that's the case. Was it a bait and switch during the campaign? There is one view in Tehran that believes that the incoming administration wanted to make sure they don't talk to Trump at all, and that this promise of better days under Biden was sort of kept alive. But the real policy began to be unveiled after they came in. It's also possible that during the campaign, the administration expected a much better position in the Senate and Congress, and the political capital now required dealing with Iran in the Senate is now very different than if they had more of a cushion in the Senate. And finally, I think the administration also, once it came in, it began to deal much more realistically with points that Suzanne mentioned, which is the JCPOA, for better or for worse, had a timeline that assumes sustained momentum towards positive things. Now, we cannot do retroactive history, but what we know is that the Trump years are wasted years. So the deal was scuttled. We are where we are. Important clauses of the deal come due in 2023, including limits on Iran's missiles, on its research. By 2023, in a perfect world, Iran should ratify the additional protocol into its law, and the United States should ratify JCPOA in Congress. Now, we all know that's not going to happen. So technically, JCPOA is already past its shelf life. It's within 2 years, both countries will be in violation. So, and in addition to that, this will happen under President Biden's watch, a year before a presidential election. So even the domestic people in Biden's team would have a great deal of trepidation about spending a lot of political capital, lifting sanctions and restoring JCPOA for a deal that is pretty quickly dead on arrival. And Suzanne's right. There is a dilemma between lifting sanctions on Iran and incentivizing continued negotiations. Although I do think there are possibilities. In a sense, the Iranians are also interested not in certain pathway that would give any kind of a deal with the U.S. legs that they're not back to where they were with Trump. Let's say if you have a President Pompeo or President Haley coming back into office. And some of this is also on us. The United States is not in a position to also provide certain degree of guarantees to any interlocutor, let alone the Iranians. But the longer, stronger deal was based also on the assumption that the longer you wait, the better it is for the United States. And I think at least a segment of the administration decided that that's not necessarily the case. The Iranians started talking about 60% enrichment. Even the Supreme Leader did that a month ago, that they began to dig in. They played a very tough game with IAEA, giving it access for another 3 months, conditional to information. That end of May, they could kick out the IAEA. The opinion in Iran began to harden. And I think the administration came to the view that, look, in a kind of a frozen situation, the Iranians will keep enriching. Right now, they have 55 kilograms of 20% enriched uranium. By September, it'll be 65, 75. The leverage will grow. You have to pay them off even more. And then starting from zero with a new hardline Iranian administration is going to be harder than at least getting things going now, but at least continuing later. So that's why they agreed to the Vienna talks. Both sides agreed to show up. Although I think there is a gap initially again at Vienna, that the US went to Vienna to start talking about the longer and stronger deal, whereas the Iranians went to Vienna to talk about JCPOA. So the Iranians wanted a sort of a pathway, a roadmap to compliance for compliance, whereas the US was willing to concede on giving Iran some of its frozen money in exchange for compliance, but not sanctions relief, holding on to sanctions for future negotiations. Now, it looks like the US position has softened because it's put some more, it's willing to now negotiate over sanctions. But I don't think that we're going to get to JCPOA, because in a best case scenario, the US can only lift some of the sanctions that Trump put in place for practical as well as other reasons, because some of these sanctions are now multi-designated and you cannot lift them. So the Iranians essentially would be in a position that they would go back to JCPOA under more sanctions than they were in 2017. It's almost like the US is saying, you have to accept some of the sanctions Trump put on you, even though at that point in time, technically, you were not in violation and he didn't have reasons to leave JCPOA. But in reality is that, you have to pay a cost for what he did. And that's not politically easily sellable in Iran. So I don't see a path to JCPOA. I see a path that they could get to an interim deal, which is that there will be some kind of a negotiation for something Iran would get, for something Iran would give, which is not be a restoration of JCPOA. I think for Iranians that works because that kicks the can down the road. They have a presidential election. They don't want necessarily to rock the vote before that, but it won't work for the US. Because all the issues that Suzanne raised, that Iran can, if it's not even in JCPOA, we definitely are not going to get to a longer and stronger deal. And we don't have as much leverage in putting sanctions now as we have leverage in lifting sanctions. And and at some point, maybe it's after a new Iranian president is in, the US will need to take an interim deal and try to make something else out of it. So I see this to be on an ongoing basis. It's going to be a long, protracted negotiation that is going to be piecemeal. I don't think that we're going to get to a restoration of JCPOA, but that doesn't mean that there cannot be agreements that would help de-escalate the situation. And I think regionally, there is US pressure on Saudi Arabia and UAE to deal with Iran. The strategic map of the region has changed. American exit from Afghanistan is a big game changer because we've shown we're willing to leave. And I think Iranians are also motivated to take advantage of ways in which to try to distance between Saudi Arabia and Israel to give an impression that they're already managing regional issues. So if the meeting in Iraq happened at the level that it said it happened, I think it's an important opening. It's not going to end regional animosity, but it's in a positive step. I think all of it benefits the administration in terms of de-escalating the situation in the Middle East, but a sort of a resolution we could put a bow tie around, I think we're not close to that.
Thanks, Vali. That's very interesting. And I just have to say that as someone who's still privy to State Department briefings, what you said is certainly not what the administration is projecting. I mean, in Vienna, they have set up now 3 committees. One deals with the nuclear steps Iran must take to get back into compliance. One is a list of sanctions that the US is prepared to lift, and one is dealing with sequencing. And according to the proverbial senior State Department official who briefed folks after the last round in Vienna, the US has already basically described the sanctions that it believes it must lift, the sanctions that it believes were improperly reclassified as terrorist by the Trump administration to try to prevent them from being lifted. And then there's a third category, which is a little bit ambiguous, where the US thinks it will have to perhaps retain those sanctions, and that they're not just a ruse to prevent a return to the JCPOA. So I'm a little surprised at your reaction. But let me go back to Suzanne. Let me get her reaction to what you said. Do you think we're headed to an interim arrangement, not some return to the JCPOA? And do you think that the politics in Iran are such that there won't be an arrangement agreed to, a roadmap agreed to before the Iranian elections on June the 18th?
Well, I think what Vali just outlined is a very plausible scenario. Obviously, there are other plausible scenarios that could happen. This is Iran, and anything is possible. But you know, the sort of bottom line that he projected, which is a kind of long, tortuous process of trying to come to some sort of an arrangement, I think it would be one that I think is probably the one with the greatest scenario with the greatest likelihood, because you know, there is both the chicken and egg problem in which both sides want to see the other move first, but there also is this asymmetry because what we want is Iran to go back to 2016 implementation protocols. And what they want is for us to go back to 2016 sanctions waivers and suspensions. And neither side can do that in full. And to some extent, we can do less than the Iranians can. And I will also just add that, you know, where we're at, it's very easy, and the Trump administration bears the lion's share of the blame for putting us into this predicament. But the predicament itself is one that we would have faced under any US administration, because the arrangement that we had in the JCPOA was always subject to misinterpretation by the Iranians, deliberate in some cases where it was projected, just as we've heard Rouhani over the course of the past few weeks, insisting that all sanctions must be lifted. That's what was said to Iranians back in 2015 and 2016, that all sanctions were going to go away. That was never the reality. But the persistence of American economic restrictions that had direct impact on Iran's ability to do business, not just with America, but with the rest of the world, was always a huge vulnerability for the JCPOA. It's one that the Iranians were pressing incessantly in the run-up to the Trump withdrawal from the deal. They were not convinced that the Obama administration had done its part to implement the deal, precisely because there was still a shadow hanging over the Iranian economy. Now, the shadow that hangs over the Iranian economy is one that is put there by this leadership, and can never be removed until and unless the leadership of the Islamic Republic decides to abide by international laws and norms. But the difficulty that we will always have is that the sanctions that remain in place because of the rest of Iran's bad behaviors will always make the JCPOA politically unpopular in Iran, and will always leave the questions of those critics on our side who believe that too much has been given away to ensure that we are, in fact, walking and chewing gum at the same time. And, you know, we have not yet demonstrated that it's possible to have a durable arms control agreement with the Islamic Republic while continuing to deter its destabilizing activities across the region, while continuing to apply pressure to the abysmal human rights situation in Iran. And you know, this to me is the broader conundrum. It's not, are we in or are we out? Because fundamentally, we're engaged in diplomacy with Iran. That's where we need to be. That, you know, we'll see what's possible on both sides. But we haven't determined an end state that is an equilibrium in the American political environment, or frankly, internationally, because you know, we need to devise an arms control agreement that can be sustained even as we try to address the other array of issues with respect to Iran. And that, to me, is one of the arguments for, you know, shooting lower and looking for an interim arrangement now. The less for less that Dennis Ross has described, or any other iteration like this, where we at least begin to reduce the risks that Vali described in terms of Iran's accumulation of LEU and HEU, and that do not require us to simply abstain from any further economic pressure on Iran. So I tend to think that that's the right way to go. And in an ideal set of circumstances, you can build upon that. Maybe it's not clear if we're going to have an ideal set of circumstances. I do just want to address the point that you raised about the Iranian elections. You know, only a fool predicts what what's going to happen in an Iranian election. And so while, it's easy to say, aha, we see the march of the military men, it's likely to turn in a hardline fashion. That's true. That's been true of Iranian politics now for the better part of a decade. That's been the general direction of Iranian politics. It's also not inconceivable that you could see them put someone up like Foreign Minister Zarif as a means of trying to shore up some kind of interest and engagement in the elections and in the regime itself. I don't know. I don't claim to know. I do know that, 8 years ago, at this point in time, it was still a mystery to us that Rouhani was going to become the anointed one. So my expectation is that Iran will manage its elections in a way that serves its interests. And it does have an interest in finding some kind of a diplomatic arrangement with the United States, which reopens at least some pathways to the international financial system. So whether that's a hardliner or a softliner or anyone in between, we will continue to talk to the Iranians.
Thanks. I'm encouraging folks, you're probably exhausted by now, but if there are any particular questions, do put them in the Q&A. Let me go back to Vali about the domestic political issue. I was part of a discussion the other day where the view was very much put forward that it would be a quote unquote hardliner, and that any benefits that might accrue from an agreement with the United States, that the system writ large would prefer that those benefits come after the election and not before. Given that we are kind of running out of time anyway, that does seem more likely. Do you see that the election will have an impact on this? What sort of candidates do you anticipate? Do you think we're going to get somebody who is identified with the IRGC? I think there's a lot of interest in this relatively young character who has headed the IRGC construction conglomerate and seems to be the epitome of the sort of young radical that Khamenei has talked about.
Right. I mean, it is a peculiar election for a number of reasons, one of which is that, the vetting of candidates happens May 11th, and up to now, there's only 2 serious candidates. And the second peculiar issue is that both are former IRGC commanders, one a senior, one a more junior one being the one you mentioned, the other one a former defense minister and senior advisor to the supreme leader. So the sort of direct involvement of IRGC commanders running for office, not that they haven't done in the past, but in this manner is perhaps new, and we'll see if they actually get vetted through the process and they stay the course, or someone else will come along. There is also this elections would happen during a COVID period. Who knows, maybe by then even the blowback from what's happening in India would again arrive in Iran, and that will have an impact. And then also we're coming at a time of great public apathy in Iran about not just elections being able to change things in Iran, but there's also even a great deal of public apathy towards JCPOA. It's not being followed in Iran with a great deal of enthusiasm, that sort of feeling of 2011, where people put a lot of stock on the first negotiations with the United States being a game changer for their lives, is gone. And I think if there was going to be an October surprise, quote unquote, for Iran, it would have had to have happened with some kind of a major breakthrough in January. I think we're too close to the elections for it to be meaningful. The talks in Vienna are not going to produce a major breakthrough. And just to point that you made, I think both what I said and what State Department said is true. There are a set of sanctions on the table, but the US is not willing to lift all 1,800 sanctions that were put in by President Trump. And so this idea of going back to a status quo ante of 2017 is just not gonna happen. So, I think it's important election, because I think the sense in Iran is that the supreme leader could pass away during the tenure of the next Iranian president. So I think there are a number of things that might be going through their mind. I mean, I think some kind of stability in the system, stability regionally, stability in the relationship with the US, some kind of a monolithic face between the different factions. I think are priorities, not for reasons of anything other than the fact that I don't think the supreme leader would want to die at a time when there is factional infighting, or the United States and Iran, or regional issues are the particularly difficult position. So to that extent, this is one step in that direction, and we'll see. And I think the very fact that we don't have a very sort of a clear candidate right now, I think speaks to a bit of the wait and see situation that we're seeing. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks. I do have some questions from an anonymous attendee. Are there, maybe I'll throw this to you, Suzanne, are there parts of the original JCPOA that you believe were not good, reasons why the previous administration might actually have done a good thing by pulling out of it? So the flaws of it. Let me just add, though, that there's one thing you didn't mention, and that is that under the original deal, Iran would not be able to have more than 300 kilograms of low enriched uranium until January 2031. I always thought that was the best insurance policy against a bomb. So if that was the good bit, what were the bad bits in your view that might have justified Trump's withdrawal?
Well, I was a critic of Trump's withdrawal. I was an advocate of the deal. So I'm probably not the best person to ask for an accounting of all the flaws in the agreement itself. I think, you know, I can point to some of the main areas of criticisms, which are, of course, the fact that some of the provisions had expiration dates or sunset clauses. That was a main concern for many of those who were dissatisfied with the deal. Many others pointed to the fact that the deal did not address Iran's missile production or capabilities, and that had been incorporated in the UN Security Council resolutions, which framed the context for the negotiations themselves. There were other criticisms that the deal did not, despite the fact that it required ostensibly a full accounting of the past military dimensions of Iran's nuclear activities, that in effect, that was done with a very big wink and a nod, with a recognition that Iran was not prepared to, in fact, acknowledge the types of activities that had been previously undertaken, but at least in the judgment at the time of the U.S. intelligence community had been put in abeyance. And I think a further criticism that has come out since the agreement is that, you know, there are aspects of what we've learned through the archives that were smuggled out by the Mossad of the program, that Iran was not forthright in terms of its own acknowledgments, that we now understand more of the program's history and the extent to which it was driven by a desire to develop nuclear weapons capability. I don't think that was really a mystery, but we have more, I think, concrete evidence of that, which may have given the negotiators a stronger hand had it been available at the time. You know, there's, of course, the criticism that we negotiated without regional partners and allies involved. I find that less persuasive than some of the specific shortcomings of the deal, simply because I don't actually attribute that to the Obama administration. It was a decision by the Bush administration in 2006 to join what had then been negotiations led by the three European states and the European Union. And I think it was exactly the right decision to make. And I think that, you know, there's little prospect of a negotiation that involved all the players and all the issues having any prospect of success. My biggest critique has always been this sort of cognitive dissonance around the sanctions, that a deal that gave Iran partial economic rehabilitation may have been all that its leadership really wanted, but it left, in particular, the United States as the one country which was always going to retain a significant repertoire of economic sanctions on Iran, in a difficult position, because the Iranians were constantly pointing to measures that we undertook as evidence that we were not compliant with the deal. And I think the Obama administration did too little to push back against those critiques, and actually, in some ways, bought into them. But I do think it creates this sort of it's a really problematic framework that if you're sanctioning and putting pressure on some aspects of the Iranian economy, but you're in fact encouraging Europeans to do business with them in order to make the arms control agreement viable, it's always going to be, I think, a very questionable arrangement in terms of long-term stability.
Thanks. Let me go back to Vali and also Suzanne, just to someone who has suffered through the last 40 years following the twists and turns of U.S.-Iran relations. What is it going to take? What is it going to take for us finally to reach some sort of normal relationship with Iran? Will it have to no longer be the Islamic Republic? Will it come after this supreme leader is no longer there? Is it too baked in? It just seems that at some point it has diminishing returns, even for an ideological regime like Iran. So, Vali, what do you think?
Well, it's very true. I mean, there is the ideological dimension. I think unlike China or the Soviet Union, Iran's revolution is still very close to its point of origin. It's still being led by people who, or a lot of them first-generation revolutionaries. Iran does not have a major security threat that would, like China did with Soviet Union, or Vietnam did with China, that would force it to go over the hump of its ideological objections. But also 40 years of the game of cat and mouse in the region has created its own geostrategic reality. That's the result of history. You know, Iran has done things in the past 40 years for offensive and defensive reasons that has created greater animus here. For instance, there's a second generation of American politicians whose memory of Iranian aggression is Iraq, not the hostage crisis of 1979. Senator Cotton, Mike Pompeo, you know, that whole generation in the U.S. military, and vice versa. The Iranians have now view the United States as a singular sort of strategic threat and the main supporter of their regional rivals. So there is that. I mean, even if Iran was not Islamic today, there is that sort of suspicion about where it sits in the region, about containing its borders, etc. So it's going to take time. I mean, it's not something that will happen, although one says these things and you could always have historical ruptures, but those are sort of black swan events. But I think, you know, Iran is going through a period of change internally. You have a generational change in the population. I think the economic realities in Iran are not necessarily sustainable in the long term, even though the state may have resistance to those. Also, America's geostrategic perspective on the Middle East is changing. I mean, if in 10 years' time, you know, we're in a different place geostrategically in terms of where our troops are, where our main focus is, it will also have an impact. But I don't think it's a matter of one or two things. And I think, you know, going back to some of the points Suzanne raised, I think for us, the reality is that, you know, there are certain priorities with Iran that we want to maintain. We don't want to go to war with it because that's a whole different set of issues. We don't want it to end up like North Korea. And I think that's the problem with those who talk about, you know, President Trump did the right thing. You can always come out of a deal and say, there's something better out there. Keep putting sanctions. They keep building. And end of the day, you know, 10 years from now, Iran may be poorer, much worse country than in terms of its leadership, but also have ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads and be in a different place. So we want to prevent that. And we want to also avoid the kinds of conflicts in the region post-Arab Spring that are basically corroding the region. So it's more a task of essentially avoiding the worst that can happen in the region, in the hope that the internal dynamics in Iran ultimately will not be sustainable. And there's no question that particularly when the supreme leader is not there, I think the issues that are facing feeding and sustaining an 85 million population with aspirations for freedom, for engagement with the world, etc., will put pressures, and Iranians have to resolve that. We can't resolve it for them, but we can all, as I said, we just have to make sure that we don't get sucked into something, the result of which might be even worse on the other side.
Suzanne, I'm going to put the same question to you. What is it going to take? Because, for all this pivot to China and so on the part of Iran, we know that the Iranian population identifies more with the West, that the Iranian diaspora is in Europe and the United States and Canada and Australia. It's not in China. That orientation, that interest in popular culture is not going to be satisfied by an alliance with China. So what will it take for the regime to finally come around and accept the reality that a relationship with the United States is in the advantage of that country writ large?
I think you, in a way, answered the question for me. This regime has built itself on animosity to the United States. The leadership is inured to that very outcome. It is a core element of the ideology of this regime. Regimes evolve, regimes change, but what we have seen is that gradual positive evolution of the Islamic Republic has been effectively forestalled by the structure of power, which ensures that meaningful change can't happen. So can meaningful change happen after a shift in leadership as a result of the death or some other incapacitation of the supreme leader? Maybe, but my sense is that much of the senior leadership is fully grounded in this ideology and this orientation, and that is not going to kind of flip overnight. Those who have already defected, at least intellectually, from that consensus have been marginalized from any role in decision making. And so, I would love to believe that a change in leadership creates a kind of moment for political entrepreneurism, where we might, in fact, see a rehabilitation of some elements of the Islamic Republic that are capable of revising their relationship with the international community. But I will say, after 20 years, I'm not optimistic about that, and and I'm not optimistic that it's necessarily a generational issue, unfortunately, because what we know is that this is an elite and a leadership that has replicated itself, that has fully grounded the up and coming elements of the leadership in the same sense of orientation. So, fundamentally, to me, it's not about the name. It's not Islamic Republic. That's not the problem. The problem is the character of the leadership. And if and when we see the fundamental orientation of this leadership change, then I think anything's possible. I have huge sense of optimism about the future of Iran, but the fundamental obstacle to achieving what I think is the true birthright of this kind of a country is posed by the leadership and its determination to sustain this antipathy toward the United States, this conviction that the United States is to blame for all of its problems. The time has come for a new approach, but the new approach has to be one that comes from Iran. We have now had every American president, as I said, try to reach out to Iran, try to negotiate with Iran, and the supreme leader's position has never changed over 40 years. He's entirely consistent, and he's entirely conspiratorial and just filled with enmity toward Washington and toward the West writ large. And that puts him, as you say, at odds with his own population, at odds with his own elite. Half the children of the Islamic Republic's most senior statesmen have made their lives and livelihoods in the United States and Canada and Europe. This is not what anyone in that country wants. But as long as those at the top are prepared to try to preserve this ideology, as long as they associate it with the longevity of their own grip on power, then I think, unfortunately, we're just locked into a very unfortunate situation.
Well, we're just about out of time. I'll put in my 2 cents. I think we had major opportunities after 9/11 that the Bush administration threw away while Khatami was still president, and we were still on the same side in Afghanistan. And I think the U.S. and the Trump experience as well, that we have vindicated the distrust of the supreme leader and any promises any American makes, because we take what we can, and then we often renege on even our own promises. So that I think is unfortunate. So I think with that, I will turn back to Mike and thank our wonderful speakers for this very interesting conversation, and thank the organizers of this for really putting on quite a day. Can I just add also that after the Trump administration, which did seem to be allergic to expertise from or about Iran, it is really wonderful to see that the Biden administration actually wants to try to understand this topic before it makes major decisions. So thank you very, very much.
Barbara, Suzanne, Vali, I want to echo that. I just want to thank you so much for really finishing up what I think was a very successful day. We started the day with a goal to stress test our way of thinking of the Iran security challenge, identify any biases that we might have, but really try to understand it from other perspectives, that red teaming perspective. From the Iranian perspective, the Middle East perspective, our pacing threats perspective, and our allies in Europe. And then I think you guys did a wonderful job in bringing that all together and considering different ways that we can move forward. So on behalf of the University of Kansas, also our partner, the International Relations Council of Kansas City, I want to again thank you and all of our panel members for making this a truly successful conference. I want to thank the Office of Director of National Intelligence and the Intelligence Community Center of Academic Excellence program, in which the University of Kansas is part of, for sponsoring this program. And I look forward to hosting this again next year on a new topic. So again, one last thing, we will have the recording of this up probably in a week or so, both on the International Relations Council of Kansas City page, as well as the University of Kansas Graduate Military Programs homepage. So again, one more time, thank you very much for you all.